What have you learned from your audience feedback? In gaining audience feedback, I had 3 clear points of focus. Our initial pitch, the production itself, and our individual digipacks that followed. One way I found really useful and easy to collect feedback was through filmed responses. These were either with individuals or in groups. It was a way of sparking a discussion rather than being really specific and concise, sort of allowed ideas to flow quite freely. So before asking the class, we came up with these key questions which I focused on throughout my feedback. What age range is the music video applicable to? What do you think about the use of portrait shots? Do the different settings and scenarios suit the lyrics of the song? What do you understand from the video's narrative? Do you like the inclusion of 2 narratives alongside one another? Does handheld camera work suit the video and its narrative? We had this idea of focusing on youth, and I wanted particular focus on handheld camera work. I was concerned that it looked messy, but actually the class were really useful and said that it suited the narrative. Rachel raised the point that if we used a tripod and if I'd created a really structured, composed video, it wouldn't have correlated to narrative and it being personal and breaking the fourth wall. My particular interest with this meant I followed it up with Katie in some one-on-one feedback. She sort of repeated these ideas, and hearing it from multiple people affirmed that we'd made the right decision.
One of the things that I really liked about your video is the handheld camera work, and I think it was really reflective of your plot because it follows like the everyday lives of these characters in a natural way.
As well as gaining video feedback, we got verbal feedback. So I found this a really useful way of gaining sort of impromptu, immediate responses from people rather than having to quite formally ask people. So this was either regarding quick changes to camera work or even sound. This meant that it was quite immediate changes we'd made, it wasn't a long process. So one key example of this was an accidental eyeline match that Sophie pointed out for us. So we asked her to watch the video just generally for feedback, and it's something she really interestedly pointed out, that there was a point at which it looked as if there was quite sloppy editing, which we hadn't actually intended. And it's things like this that made the idea of working as a class and constantly giving each other feedback really, really useful. More specifically, what she meant was, at this point when Sam looks to the right, it looks as if he's looking towards Julia, when in actuality it's supposed to be 2 separate situations. I think working in a group and working so intensively on the same footage and it being quite snappy straight cuts meant that we hadn't seen it. So I think it was critical to ask for other people's ideas and feedback. One critical way for me of gaining lots of feedback at once and independently from my group to then share was through written feedback. This was either one-on-one, literally handing a piece of paper and asking to scribble things out, or using things like WhatsApp. So when I first put forward our pitch, we gained lots of little slips like this about the ideas they had and any changes they could make, because this was a point where we were just developing the idea. As our idea became more fleshed out and finalised, I took to using things like WhatsApp. So I sent a message out to a couple of my friends and people I thought would be able to give really useful feedback about what they thought. And I was lucky that they sent lots of chunky paragraphs, and having someone give feedback that wasn't in our media class was a much more objective point of view, as they hadn't seen it before and weren't really sure what the narrative was about. So I picked out a few key ideas. So this person said, I really enjoyed the cutaways to the surrounding environment, which was perhaps to show isolation felt by the single individual. Now this was an idea I hadn't actually considered or intended explicitly to be in the video, and I think that's a key idea of our idea, that it's quite ambiguous, it's not completely set in their ways, so sort of the negotiated reading as suggested by Stuart Hall. Another idea was that I really liked the contrast between the 2 narratives, and this kind of split editing between the 2 made it really interesting, and I'm glad people picked up on that. And finally, a more detailed idea was that I thought it was clear that your character wasn't completely happy, but it wasn't overly obvious, like the way you mixed in her looking bored with actually smiling was good. It wasn't like always looking bored. I think it would be too obviously done if she was sad the whole time. And I found this really encouraging piece of feedback because it meant people understanding our narrative, but it wasn't too explicit, sort of being thrown in people's faces. On completing my digipack, I took to asking people whether it correlated with the video and the general ideas of urban environments, youth, sort of conflict in people. And I took a tally chart because I thought that the more closed quantitative data of yes and no's would be more decisive, and then if there were no's, I would go about asking particularly what those changes were. I was lucky enough that there were no no's, and I thought, because I'd asked a predominantly youth sort of group, I asked my parents about what they thought. And my dad said urban environment, immediate association with youth. I think is a really interesting idea, because though he may not necessarily feel part of our target audience, it's nice that someone else can recognise that that's our aim, even if it's not for that person. And this idea of merging between urban and youth and stories, which I took quite literally into my digipack, using GIMP to cross over between the two, and that's an idea a lot of people really, really liked.